Today we're diving deeper into the story of John David Norman. If you missed last week's video, you can watch it here, somewhere, you'll see it. It's not necessary to watch it, but it is highly recommended because it did lay the groundwork for a lot of what we're going to be getting into here today. Speaking of, what we're getting into today is exploring the relationship between John David Norman and two of some of the most infamous serial killers of all time. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, and Dean Corll, the candy man. The system didn't just catch John Wayne Gacy. It sacrificed him to protect the 30,000 names on John David Norman's index cards. Norman supplied kids to the elite through his Odyssey Foundation, and when a kid became a problem, or he suspected that he may talk to authorities, he marked them with the kill stamp. After he marked them with the kill stamp, he sent them to John Wayne Gacy or Dean Corll for disposal. When these killers were finally caught, the elites made sure the investigations ended with them. They made sure they framed the crimes as a work of a lone wolf madman to make sure that the crimes were never traced back to the elite rich sponsors of the Odyssey Foundation. Alright, so now we're going to start with just a quick little recap of John David Norman in last week's video. So, John David Norman, or who I like to refer to him as the Jeffrey Epstein of the 1970s, was born in 1927 in Ada, Oklahoma. By all accounts, he seemed to be a normal kid. There's even a newspaper article written about him that talked about him being a pianist, being a good student, and like I said, by all accounts, seemed to be just a normal, well-to-do kid. But by the age of around 27, he had finally found himself first getting in trouble. This case that he got in trouble with is pretty unclear. The details are very unclear, just due to the fact that it was so long ago and the court records were not preserved pretty much whatsoever. All we know is that they were quote-unquote sex crimes, and that's about all we get. But it's not too big of a deal because he actually wasn't convicted on those. So he was a normal kid in school. He was also a normal kid outside of the school. He was a broadcast engineer with a radio station. He did go to college and got a degree. And like I said, by all accounts, from teachers, friends, colleagues, he was a normal kid, person, classmate. And that's what's scary about this specific story, is that he blended in so well for so long. But like I said, his facade did not hold up forever. He was first arrested when he was around 28 years old. It was in 1954, and he was arrested again in 1956, and these were both in Houston, Texas. Nothing serious came out of these charges. I think he may have served a few months, and that was about it. But once again, the records into the specific charges, both of them, are not super clear. We just know he did pretty much just get a slap on the wrist. And that's pretty much all we know when it comes to the early life of John David Norman, and most of that really isn't important, so it's not too big of a deal that we don't know all the details. But when things start to get more important and start to get a little darker is when we start talking about the Odyssey Foundation. This is what most of the last video took place on and was about. So the Odyssey Foundation, to put it simply, was a national child trafficking ring that trafficked underage boy prostitutes to elite, rich, powerful sponsors of this program. But John David Norman was pretty smart. Like I said, broadcast engineer, went to college, and he didn't just advertise his business for exactly what it was. No, he actually had it registered as a nonprofit with the aims of enhancing the lives of underprivileged youth by connecting them with older sponsors to take them on educational adventures. Yeah, I know, it sounds weird already, but back then, that was enough to make sure, no one paid too much attention, at least for a while. So the way this foundation worked and the way that they actually trafficked these children is John David Norman had a catalog. This catalog specifically was called the Delta Project. Remember that for later. This is going to become a big part of our video as we go down the line. But this Delta Project, like I said, it was a catalog, and it was a catalog of hundreds of underage boy prostitutes. Boys that John David Norman had lured either off the streets, they were usually runaways and had some sort of personal trouble going on in their lives in some sort of fashion. So he would get these boys, he would get them on this catalog, he would charge people, first of all, a one-time initiation fee, which was about $15, and then I think it was about like a $5 per catalog fee every few months. After that, the sponsors, like the buyers, were the older PDF files, right? Those were called sponsors. The underage boys were called fellows. Once again, like I said, John David Norman didn't just throw all this out there and, in plain sight. He tried to at least cover it as best as he could. So, you had the fellows and you had the sponsors. Sponsors would get these catalogs, and they would find a fellow that they liked, and then they would contact John David Norman, and a flight would be arranged, and they would usually fly out and stay with these sponsors from anywhere from 3 to 5 days. The sponsors would pay for the flight, they'd pay for the food for the fellow. I'm going with that. Yeah, they pretty much paid for everything and would take these kids supposedly on educational adventures. But I think we all know what was really going on, and it is very, very disturbing. John David Norman had boys flying all over the country to be abused, and he turned them into business transactions. Like I said, this was a national trafficking organization with tons of high-value clientele. John David Norman was not just a predator. He ran a network of predators and victims, and he profited from the abuse. This network commingled serial killers, federal employees, and society's elite. But this wasn't all just for John Norman's greed or insatiable ideations. But in fact, this was actually a beta test for the modern trafficking networks we see today, like Jeffrey Epstein's, Diddy's, and the many others we have yet to discover. So, I've told you about the Odyssey Foundation, but I haven't told you how it was discovered. So we're going to go into that right now. It was discovered actually through an anonymous, it was reported as anonymous. We now know who it was. It was an FBI tip from this person called Charles Brizendine. Charles Brizendine was actually a previous victim, associate. It's not 100% clear. I've read different accounts saying different things. From all that I've read, I want to assume that he was a victim, and that maybe certain police at the time just wrongly assumed that he was an associate rather than a victim. But he was an informant to the FBI. He gave a tip to the FBI about John David Norman, the Odyssey Foundation, the Delta Project, and pretty much told the FBI that John David Norman was running an underage boy prostitution ring, specifically a mail order boy prostitution ring, and he was doing it through the mail, and he was having boys flown all over the country. So obviously the FBI responded, and they got a warrant, and they raided John David Norman's apartment. And what they found in there was disturbing. Obviously, they found John David Norman. With him, they found 5 underage boys, cameras, and tons of CSAM, or CP. Yes, that is very, very disturbing. And you would hope at this point that John David would be arrested. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, he was not. But not only did they discover that John David Norman was running this underage boy prostitution ring, they discovered something very, very interesting, which was a cache of 30,000 index cards. But the police didn't just discover that John David Norman was running an underage boy prostitution ring. They discovered a cache of 30,000 index cards that all had at least 1 or 2 names of sponsors. Remember, the adult PDF file clients of John David Norman. They had their names, so pretty much it was a client list written down on a bunch, 30,000 index cards, right? That's the modern equivalent to Jeffrey Epstein's little black book. This would be huge information, right? This gives you information to be able to go and arrest and take down a ton of horrible bad people. But this is where things start to get really, really frustrating, if they haven't already, with John David Norman continually getting off the hook and getting out of jail. So, with these index cards, the police chief at the time that was in charge of the raid, blah, 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 he ended up sending these to the FBI, right? The FBI were there at the raid, right? The FBI then sent them to the State Department. The State Department wanted them for quote-unquote, because they were investigating quote-unquote passport fraud. That was why they wanted the names. So they sent them all to the State Department. The State Department investigated them all for passport fraud. They found that none of the names were involved with any sort of passport fraud, so they destroyed them. Yeah, you heard me right. They destroyed all 30,000 index cards with the names of all these rich, powerful PDF files that were having boys shipped to them across the country right? These names just destroyed because they didn't relate to passport fraud. Yeah, I told you it was going to get frustrating. If that doesn't make you mad, I don't know what will. But once again, sorry to burst your bubble, you're going to get even more frustrated. Next thing that we're going to get into is a lot of this story that I'm telling you right now. It's really all based off of newspaper and secondhand reports, because not just were there's 30,000 index cards destroyed, pretty much all legitimate evidence related to this case you cannot find. I don't know if it was specifically destroyed, but they've made it to where you can't find it, or it's very, very difficult to find any sort of real information on this case whatsoever. Another thing that we're going to get into that's going to be even more frustrating is something we're going to get into was a boy who was supposed to testify against John David Norman. Maybe finally he was up for justice. But this boy, his name was Kenneth Hellstrom. He was a 15-year-old boy from Dallas who was allegedly a fellow in the Odyssey Foundation, right? One of the boys that were trafficked by John David Norman. And like I said, he was set to testify in court against John David Norman. Before he could testify, he was found dead in Chicago from a ritualistic murder. And another thing that we need to get into before we really start diving into the deep theories of this video were the kill files. This is also a big part of the last video. So if you want a deeper dive into this, just go ahead and watch the last video, because this is going to be a quick overview. So, the kill files, what do I mean by that? So, the catalogs that had all the boys that the sponsors got that they looked through, and that they would find a boy that they would like and then order that. Well, when police raided Norman's apartment, they found that catalog. They found all sorts of lists of different underage boys, victims, and they found one list, and on this list there was a number of different boys' names and pictures that had the word kill stamped onto it. Yes, stamped. But Norman had an excuse. He said that just meant that those boys were no longer part of his organization, and that meant that they were fired. And the police, they believed him. They took him at his word. So, like I said, it's gonna get more frustrating. It's gonna keep getting more frustrating. So, buckle in. Kill files though, right? One of the boys that had the stamp kill on their name was Kenneth Hellstrom, the boy found dead that was set to testify against John David Norman. But of course, that lead wasn't looked into. Nope, it was pretty much a dead end, and his case went unsolved. And Kenneth Hellstrom wasn't the only boy that had the kill stamp next to his name that ended up missing. There were multiple boys that were confirmed to have had the kill stamp on their name, and had also been found to have been on a missing persons list. But to figure out how these boys ended up with a stamp next to their name to actually being dead, we're going to have to start looking into the relationship that John David Norman had with John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll. So we're going to dive into that right now. Alright, to explain the relationship between John Wayne Gacy and John David Norman, I first have to introduce you into a new character. This new character's name is Philip Paskey. Philip Paskey was a close associate, even called the right-hand man to John David Norman. He helped him run his Delta project, the Odyssey Foundation. He was there for him when John David Norman did his short stints in jail. They were pretty much business partners, and like I said, he was John David Norman's right-hand man. But John David Norman wasn't the only sicko that Philip Paskey knew. Philip Paskey was from and lived in Chicago, the same city that John Wayne Gacy lived in. And he didn't just live in the same city as John Wayne Gacy. He actually worked with John Wayne Gacy. I shouldn't have said worked with, I should have said worked for. He worked for John Wayne Gacy at John Wayne Gacy's company called PDM Contracting. But Paskey really wasn't just an employee of John Wayne Gacy. They too were very close friends. So close that Philip Paskey had a spare set of keys to John Wayne Gacy's house that Gacy had gave him. So this isn't 7 degrees of separation where we're very sparsely piecing together this relationship between John Wayne Gacy and John David Norman. No, it's one link, one very easy link. This one guy, Philip Paskey, that's the one link, and he was very close to both of them. it's very, very, very easy to imagine how they could end up working together. How Philip Paskey could have put John Wayne Gacy and John David Norman in contact. It makes perfect sense, and even the way that their cities that they're from Dallas and Chicago, the way the highways connect, it just makes way too much sense for it not to be true. But I'm not just gonna give you my speculation. There is a little bit of proof to this theory. I think this little bit of proof is all we really need to do to fully connect the dots ourselves. So, Gacy actually did an interview after he was caught. And in this interview, he claimed he was part of a larger ring that operated out of Dallas. And he specifically mentioned Norman's Delta Project. He was actually known, supposedly, to have been a huge fan of Norman's Delta Project. But he specifically mentioned Norman's Delta Project, and he claimed it involved snuff films and elite sponsors. So, he definitely knew what was going on with the Odyssey Foundation and John David Norman. So, like I said, it's not just conjecture, it's not just speculation. There, first of all, was a legitimate connection by Philip Paskey, and there was also the admission by John Wayne Gacy himself that he knew of and admired John David Norman and his work. So, next thing we're going to get into is John David Norman's relationship or his involvement with Dean Corll. Dean Corll being another infamous serial killer of around the same time, his nickname being the Candyman. I'm not going to get too much into Dean Corll specifically himself because it's such a big case and it would be its own whole video series. So I'm going to give you the very, very basics of him. Pretty much he was a serial killer. He had younger boys, specifically 2 younger boys that worked with him to abduct other boys and to do the things that he did to them. And it actually ended up being his downfall. One of the boys that worked with him ended up actually being the one that eventually killed him. And we're going to get into that in just a bit. But to show you how close the timing was between Dean Corll and John David Norman, and just geography-wise and time-wise, they were very close. So, Dean Corll was busted August 1973, and it was exactly 2 months before the Dallas raid on John David Norman, where they discovered the Odyssey Foundation and that he was running a trafficking network. So now we're going to get straight into the evidence of how these 2 people were actually connected. So to bring back, like I said earlier, how Dean Corll had young boys that worked under him, and specifically, it was one of them that killed Corll. The one that killed Corll was Elmer Wayne Henley. And after he killed Corll, he talked with police, he did interviews, he was pretty vocal about what he did and his involvement and everything. But in an interview with police, he told them he was being paid $200 per boy by a Dallas organization. Put 2 and 2 together. He actually specifically, you don't even have to put 2 and 2 together though. He actually specifically mentioned the name Norman. And he said that Norman operated a group that bought and sold boys, right? The Odyssey Foundation. And we can even trace this beginning of, this relationship back a little bit earlier, before Elmer Wayne Henley or any of him or getting caught or any of that, because Norman actually lived in Houston in the mid-1950s during the same time as Corll. He got in trouble. Remember, he got in trouble in Houston. So it makes sense that they probably would have been both running in this, whatever you want to call it, really weird PDF file undercurrent of Houston at the time. So I personally believe there's a big chance that they had met each other way back then. And Dean Corll found himself in a similar situation as John Wayne Gacy, where he knows this guy from back in the day, John David Norman, who's suddenly able to supply him with all these underage boys. And these 2 people are sickos, right? They are crazy sicko individuals that get off on being sadist and hurting people, right? There's crazy serial killers, right? And the media and the world history would have you believe that it was just that they were as crazy individuals and they killed because they just wanted to kill. But John David Norman's kill stamps they prove otherwise. These serial killers were not just randomly just killing for the sake of killing, right? There's multiple of both Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy victims, John Doe victims of both of those guys that were never identified, right? They had general descriptions, no names, never identified, but these general descriptions matched up with the descriptions of a lot of the different boys that had the kill stamp on their name, right? So like I said, these serial killers weren't all the time, at least, just killing for the sake of killing. In these specific circumstances with these specific boys, I think it makes perfect sense that John David Norman was delivering these boys, the boys that had the kill stamp stamped on their name, right? They had it stamped on their name because I guess they were deemed too much of a trust issue, right? They were scared that they might go talk to police or all sorts of things. But for whatever reason, they didn't think it was, they felt that they needed to get rid of these boys. So they would, put the kill stamp, designate them as, kill, get rid of. And then somehow, right, they already transported these boys across the entire country, like flying them all over to meet with these older sponsors. So it's not a huge leap of faith to believe that they could transport them to John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll. Like I said, they're all connected by major highways, so it makes perfect sense. So this is all part of a big system, right? And John David Norman wasn't even at the top himself of this system. He was just a key player. But just like on a football team, a quarterback is the key player, right? But he's not the owner of the team. And also, it makes it a lot easier to win when you're a quarterback if you have Roger Goodell, having your back, changing the rules for you. And that's exactly what John David Norman had. He had institutional backing to a mind-numbing degree. We dove a little bit into this in the last video and about how he was always able to get out of trouble. He was always able to have his bail posted for him. Just non-stop slap on the wrists to the point where it's very obvious that he had some sort of institutional backing, some sort of rich, powerful people that didn't want to see him get locked up, that didn't want to see him go to jail. And this institutional protection mainly happened mainly occurred in three different layers. It occurred federally, the local law enforcement level, and at a media level. So federally, the way that it happened is it started with Matthew Nimitz. He was the counselor of the Department of State at the time when the Department of State received the 30,000 names of all the clients of John David Norman, right? All the people that should have been arrested. So, in May 1977, Nimitz admitted to a congressional subcommittee that the State Department had received the files from the Dallas raid. He also testified that the department destroyed up to 30,000 index cards containing the name of the sponsors. He admitted that in court. He also admitted that the cards were destroyed because they were not relevant to any sort of passport fraud. Yeah, he admitted that, whatever that means. And what this federal level of protection did is it ensured that the sponsors, the federal employees, the lawyers, and public figures, it ensured that they would never be prosecuted and their names would never even make it to the media. And then he had local level protection, right? Like in Dallas and Houston and Illinois. In Dallas, the district attorney, Henry Wade, right? He prosecuted Norman, but he gave him an insanely short sentence, reduced his charges, while there was evidence, like clear as day evidence, that he was running a trafficking ring, right? Something that he should have been sent away for his entire life, right? This DA gives him a slap on the wrist, right? And a DA doesn't just do that for no reason, right? Someone higher up came down and told him to make that decision. But it didn't just happen in Dallas, right? It also happened in Houston. Benny Newman, who is the lead Houston detective on the Corll case, right? Investigating Dean Corll, the Candyman. Elmer Wayne Henley, an accomplice to Dean Corll, told Benny Newman that a Dallas group paid for victims. And what did the detective do? He ignored it. I'm sure he wanted to investigate it, I'm sure he did, right? But when you're a detective and you get an order, when you're any sort of police department person, when you get an order from a higher up, you listen to it, or else you're subordinate. And Detective Newman publicly stated that Corll acted alone, even after he had heard the testimony of Elmer Wayne Henley. But like I said, it's probably not specifically because he wanted to do that. He was getting institutional pressure. And now lastly, we're going to look at the institutional protection from the media. The authorities in the media, specifically focused on just the sensational, gory, crazy facts of both Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy. You'd say, yeah, that's obvious. It's all the news reports on. You'd be right. But it also served a very clear purpose here. It made sure that the idea that these guys were lone wolf, just crazy serial killer lunatics, it cemented that idea into the public's head. Think about it. If the dudes are insane, then it makes sense that it's random. And if it's random, it couldn't have been done by a network. There's no reason to look any deeper whatsoever if it's just two crazy psycho serial killers. But Gacy himself told lawyers and media that he did not act alone. Did they report on that? Did they bring that up in court? No, they didn't. They continued to apply the label of the killer clown to create a sensational headline and to get people talking about it, but not talking about the right things. It drowned out any sort of real investigations. And same with the media when it came to reporting about Corll. Not much was said about Elmer Wayne Henley and the Dallas group and how they were buying boys from him. None of that was really reported on. You can't find any headlines barely at all. I think you can find one. That's my source. One headline. That's it. You think that would have been a huge thing they would have been reporting on? That there possibly could have been a network involved with these killings? You think that would have been the ultimate sensationalism? So it's clear, right? There was a federal level of protection. There was a local law enforcement level of protection. And there was a media level of protection. All from some sort of institutional gatekeepers or Illuminati or whatever you want to call them. The people that pull the strings is pretty much the only kind of name you need for them. Because these people pulled all sorts of strings to make sure that the 10 plus unidentified John Doe victims between Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy were never investigated and looked into the possible connection with the boys and the kill stamps and the ones that had gone missing from John David Norman's group. It was never looked into. It was never looked into because Gacy and Corll getting caught tied off the loose ends that they needed tied off. And the trail ends there for the victims. Partial justice is not true justice. The reason John Wayne Gacy is a household name and John David Norman isn't is because the system worked exactly like it was supposed to. So to conclude the video, I think it's very clear that John David Norman, Dean Corll, and John Wayne Gacy were all working together in a system that was bigger than all three of them, that was trafficking and murdering underage boys for the pleasure of rich, elite individuals. Let that fact set for a second. Let that fact set in and then get back to me. If you guys found this deep dive interesting, make sure you go ahead, give this video a like, give me a follow or subscribe. It's the only way to keep these stories moving through the algorithm so you can keep getting more. If there's a certain conspiracy theory or mystery that you'd like to see investigated, go ahead and drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to cover it. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay sovereign.